All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 21, Section 2, Progressivism at the Grassroots Level. So, recall that progressives wanted to, generally speaking, improve society. That is the goal, and that it was something that came from the grassroots, then up to the state, and eventually to the federal level. So a lot of these laws are being passed very locally, city, for example. Then you get laws passed on the state level, and then lastly, you're going to pass at the federal level. And that in order to improve society, most progressives believe that it's got to be the job of the government. And so in order for the government to, really get rid of a problem like corruption, there needs to be a process of getting corruption out of the government or expanding democracy. That if government's going to solve problems, well, then we have to make sure the government is not corrupt. And so many of the earliest efforts by the progressives is essentially to clean up the democratic process and have government really be responsive to the needs of the people. And this was done in a couple of ways. So these laws right here, again, are being passed essentially on a state level. First of all, the direct primary. If you're not familiar, the primary election is the process by which the Democrats and Republicans choose their candidate. And in most cases, these were just chosen by party bosses, elites of the party. Increasingly, you have this process of Democrats and Republicans choosing their candidate by elections. So this gave people more power to choose who it is that's going to run in the election for president, for whatever ends up being. Many states passed the direct primary law, giving more power to the people when it came to choosing particular candidates. The initiative and referendum are kind of like the same thing almost. This lets people, in the case of the initiative, lets people propose laws. In the case of the referendum, this lets people accept or reject laws, right? So if we think about how the legislative system works, essentially you have people. People choose members of their legislative branch, right? So legislative branch. And the legislative branch then passes laws, right? That's the way that it works. Now, what had happened during the Gilded Age, of course, was that, this legislative branch was corrupt, and in many cases, the laws were corrupt. So what essentially the initiative and the referendum allow for then is for people, in the case of the initiative, it simply allows for people to bypass the legislator and propose laws of their own. In the case of the referendum, if this law up here is already corrupt, it allows people either to accept it or reject it. In either case, we can see that both of them give more power to the people. In the case of the recall, it's pretty straightforward. This allows people to vote out corrupt politicians. So for example, somebody like the governor of a state who serves 4 years, well, if 2 years into their tenure, the people decide that they don't want that governor anymore, they now have the power to recall them or essentially kick them out. And again, all of these things are being passed at the state level. And during the course of the progressive era, increasingly more and more states are allowing these things to happen. Lastly, we do have an amendment to the Constitution that helps to expand the process of democracy, and that is the 17th Amendment, which allows for the direct election of U.S. senators. And in fact, prior to the 17th Amendment, the choosing of senators worked very much in the same way that laws did, and that was state legislatures got to choose them, right? So we'll write senator over here. And so exactly like the referendum with the 17th Amendment, it simply allowed for people to bypass the legislature and choose senators directly and choose them by democratic vote. And of course, senators, there are 100 senators in the country. Well, at the time, it would have depended how many states that there were, but each state gets 2 senators. So again, more power to the people. It should be noted that when it came to expanding democracy in the progressive movement, there was in fact little, maybe we'll go back and not to confuse this with the 17th Amendment. But there was very little that was done to address Jim Crow, which of course was the way in which African Americans were prevented from exercising their democratic rights, specifically in the southern states. And so once you had a government that was, more responsive to the demands of the people, once you had gotten rid of the corrupt legislator and corrupt laws, then the progressives could work more towards improving society. So one of the key components of the progressive movement was expertise and efficiency, especially this point about expertise. The progressives wanted experts, not politicians, to determine law. You had instances during the Gilded Age like machine politics, like William Tweed and the Tammany Hall political machine, which were notoriously corrupt. And progressives really targeted people like Tweed, and specifically machine politics, which was essentially, political favors in exchange for power. And so rather than getting the politicians to do it, some cities created kind of new government systems for issues to get addressed. One way was to have commissions, and that was to create commissions for specific needs. So you might have something like a water commission, which would deal specifically only with issues relating to that city's water source, for example. You also had specific city managers, which were hired to tackle specific issues within cities. Again, these would have been experts, not, politicians. And many states adopted the city manager program. The most famous progressive on the local level by far was Robert La Follette, who you see pictured here. And he turned Wisconsin, or the Wisconsin idea, which is the hiring of, or maybe not the hiring, but at least just the consulting of experts and scientists to draft law, which would then, the goal would be to improve whatever was going on with that city. Sometimes Wisconsin was called the laboratory of progressivism, because a lot of these new ideas regarding how to make a government more efficient occurred in Wisconsin first. And so everybody looked towards Wisconsin as kind of like this progressive experiment, and Robert La Follette was leading the way. Some of these ideas were influenced by Taylorism, which was scientific management. This was actually something that businesses had adopted. When you think about the Gilded Age, what businesses were incredibly effective at doing was efficiency, right? And so this idea that businesses would be as efficient as possible to reap the most amount of profits, Taylorism, which was named after the person who invented this, the scientific management, they adopted this idea of efficiency from business and really made it work for government. And this was to make government work better, and generally speaking, society work better as well. So that was more on the legal front, right, in the form that governments were created. But progressives also worked outside the government as well to address problems of society, right? Social justice. Whenever you see this word social, think society. People like Jane Addams, who created Hull House, which was we might call this an institution to assist the urban poor. This was not there was no law that created Hull House. Jane Addams simply just set up this settlement house really under her own will, and set it out to help with the people who had lived in Chicago specifically, but there were settlement houses all over the country. You also had other grassroots movement push forward for changes in society. One of the big issues was child labor, of course, during the Gilded Age. And so organizations like the National Child Labor Committee brought attention to child labor. and in fact succeeded in getting some laws passed. The Keating-Owen Act prohibited interstate, which means between the states, trade, which used child labor. So in other words, the Keating-Owen Act made it illegal to sell stuff from one state to another if it had used child labor. Now, the Keating-Owen Act was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, so it really didn't have a huge impact on society, although its passage is significant. But much later, the Fair Labor Standards Act essentially upheld the idea that the Keating-Owen Act did. This was, the Keating-Owen Act was 1910s. The Fair Labor Standards Act was 1930s. And again, it more or less prohibited interstate trade where child labor was used. Like Jane Addams, one of the advocates for not just children, but also for consumers was Florence Kelley. She established the National Consumers League, which was an organization which would only purchase goods from businesses that used, sort of fair working and labor standards. So this really brought attention to the poor and what we might call exploitive working conditions. And of course, working conditions were a big problem during the Gilded Age. The workplace was very dangerous. It was very low pay. Workers were often exploited. And organizations like the National Consumers League wanted to create a group of consumers, buyers, who could use their purchasing power in order to not purchase from places that exploited their workers. And this was one way of trying to get some change instituted. Now, the issue of working conditions had long been a problem in American society, but it really became publicized with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. So this really brought what we might call nationwide attention to the workplace. And that was because this fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, was a factory that was on top of a 10-story building. The doors were locked because the factory workers were taking breaks when they weren't supposed to. And they were producing textiles, shirtwaists, and the factory caught on fire. And because all of the doors were locked, the only choice that the young women had working inside was to jump to their deaths. And so this was a very publicized case where you had a lot of young immigrant women, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, jumping out of a 10-story building to their death on the streets below in New York City, which was very, very crowded. So there certainly was more deadly workplace accidents during the Progressive Movement and Gilded Age, where more people died, but nothing quite got the nation's attention like this particular story. And that really sort of helped get the ball rolling when it came to workplace reforms and improving the safety conditions in the workplace. One last way that progressives wanted to improve society was to prohibit alcohol, prohibition. You had organizations like the Women Christian Temperance Union, which had worked to get laws passed to ban alcohol. Now, there had been a long history in the United States of prohibition at the local and state level. So, for example, you had various states and counties in the United States that would either be described as dry, which meant alcohol was illegal, or wet. And this battleground of dries versus wet all across the country had gone on for decades before the progressive era. But many progressives believed that if you just got rid of alcohol, in fact, a lot of the problems in society would go away. And that was a very reasonable expectation. The progressive movement got to the point where it was so influential and so strong, specifically the dry position, that the 18th Amendment to the Constitution banned the sale, transport, and manufacture of alcohol. And this happened in 1920. So in 1920, the drives won out completely on a national level, that once the 18th Amendment was passed, that meant that it was illegal to sell, transport, or manufacture alcohol all across the country. And this was considered to be a big victory for the progressive movement. Now, there were some progressives who we might not categorize them fully as progressives, but we call them maybe radical progressives. And these were people who were of the belief that society was too far gone. So society is too, maybe not far gone. We'll use this word, corrupt, for reform. So they want to really use more radical, or they have more radical ideas about what should happen to American society. This means, in most cases, it means to overthrow, R-O-W, capitalism. And you had two groups, and they were influential in the progressive movement in that they got progressive support for some issues, but progressives didn't want to overthrow capitalism. They just wanted to make society better. The radicals want to remake society. Two of these organizations include the Socialist Party of America, the SPA, and the Industrial Workers of the World. Again, they had a more kind of extreme goal of overthrowing capitalism, although they had various or slightly different ways of going about it. The Industrial Workers of the World, or sometimes called the Wobblies, really wanted to utilize the strike or the labor strike, the refusal of workers to go to work in order to change society. The Socialist Party of America was much more interested in voting, that they believed they can still work within the political system, whereas the Wobblies said, no, the political system is also it's too corrupt as it is. We have to take direct action. Eugene Debs was one of the leaders of the Socialist Party of America, and this is Eugene Debs pictured right here. He was also the leader of the Pullman strike. So even though some of these radical progressives could get on board with the progressive agenda, ultimately their goal was much more extreme than what progressive reformers wanted.